The dust of the Chihuahuan desert doesn't just settle on the land, it settles in a man's soul. For Elias Thorn, master of the sprawling Thorn Creek Ranch, the dust was a shroud, a cover for a past he'd long since buried under 10,000 acres of rock and regret. He was a man carved from the harsh Texas landscape, his face a roadmap of sun and sorrow. So when a lone wagon, weathered and weary, creaked to a stop before his homestead, he expected nothing more than another drifter, another piece of human dust blowing through. But then she knocked, a woman with haunted eyes and a simple request, a request that would unravel every thread of the life he had so carefully, so painfully built. The day was bleeding out across the plains. The vast Texas sky was a wound of bruised purple and fiery orange. Elias Thorne stood on the porch of his ranch house, a solid fortress of timber and stone that seemed to grow right out of the earth it commanded. He rolled a cigarillo between his calloused fingers, the scent of tobacco mixed with the dry, dusty air and the distant, familiar smell of cattle. For 5 years, ever since his world had turned to ash, this had been his ritual, watching the sun die, feeling the familiar ache of solitude settle in for the night. His foreman, Hank Miller, had told him again that morning. Hank's face was as leathery and creased as an old saddle. Elias, you can't keep living on jerky and week-old coffee. The boys are complaining. You need a proper cook. A woman's touch, maybe. Elias had just grunted in reply. A woman's touch was the last thing he wanted. It was a woman's touch, or the memory of it, that had hollowed him out in the first place. That's when he heard it, not the familiar clatter from the bunkhouse, or the lowing of the herd. He heard the weary crunch of wagon wheels on the gravel track leading to the main house. It was the sound of desperation. No one came to Thorn Creek by accident. It was too remote, nestled deep in a valley that was both a sanctuary and a prison. He squinted his sharp eyes, picking out the dilapidated prairie schooner, pulled by a single sway-backed horse. A figure descended, moving with the stiff grace of someone who'd been traveling for far too long. As she drew closer, Elias saw it was a woman. Her dress was faded and patched, a bonnet hiding her face from the last of the sun's glare. She walked with a purpose that didn't match her exhausted frame. Her hand was held tightly by a small child, a girl of no more than 4 or 5, whose tiny legs struggled to keep pace. Elias remained motionless on the porch, a silent, imposing figure. He was not a welcoming man, and he cultivated that reputation like a prize bull. It kept trouble at a distance. The woman stopped at the foot of the porch steps, finally looking up. Her face was thin, etched with lines of hardship that made her age impossible to guess. But her eyes held a flicker of fierce, unbroken resolve. They were hazel, guarded and deep. "Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice raspy with dust. "I am," he answered. His tone was flat, unwelcoming. She swallowed, a nervous gesture, but she held his gaze. "I'm Lena Hale. This is my daughter, Rosalie." She nudged the child forward slightly. The little girl hid behind her mother's skirts, peeking out with one wide, curious eye. "I was in Redemption," Lena continued, "at the general store. Mr. Abernathy said you were looking for a cook." Elias's eyes narrowed. Abernathy, the gossiping old fool. Of course. "I might be. I'm a hard worker, sir," she said quickly, sensing a sliver of an opening. "I can cook, clean, mend. I don't ask for much. Just a fair wage, a roof over our heads, and a place where my girl can be safe. We won't be any trouble." Elias was about to refuse. He didn't want the complication. He didn't want the ghosts a woman and child would stir up in the empty rooms of his house. He didn't need the pitying looks from his men or the inevitable questions. He opened his mouth to send her on her way, maybe with a gold eagle for her trouble, a gesture of charity to ease a conscience he didn't think he had. But then the little girl, Rosalie, stepped out from behind her mother's dress. Perhaps it was a glint of the dying sun, or a trick of the deepening twilight. She tilted her head up to look at him, her small face framed by tangled locks of dark auburn hair. And in that moment, Elias Thorne's carefully constructed world fractured into a million pieces. It wasn't just the color of her eyes. It was the specific shade, a brilliant, startling cornflower blue, flecked with hints of green, like a summer sky over a field of new grass. It was the precise almond shape of them, the way they tilted up ever so slightly at the corners. They were eyes he knew better than his own reflection. Eyes he had memorized by candlelight, had seen sparkle with laughter and darken with passion. Eyes he had watched fade from this world in a fever dream of loss and regret. They were Genevieve's eyes. The cigarillo fell from his numb fingers, rolling to a stop on the weathered porch boards. The sounds of the ranch, the wind, the cattle, the crickets starting their nightly chorus, all faded into a deafening roar in his ears. His breath hitched in his chest, a painful, ragged thing. He looked from the child's impossible eyes to the mother's guarded hazel ones. A storm of confusion and a dawning, terrifying belief crashed through him. Lena saw the change in him. The blood drained from her face, her confident posture crumbling into one of pure, animal fear. She pulled her daughter back, her hand gripping the child's shoulder like a vice. She had seen that look before, the look of recognition, the look she had been running from for 5 long years. Elias took a half step forward, his voice a raw, disbelieving whisper, a sound lost to the vast, indifferent plains. Genevieve! The name was a ghost on his lips. For a long moment, he simply stared, a man seeing a specter in broad daylight. The past he had buried under years of hard labor and stoic silence was clawing its way back to the surface, and it had the face of a small child. He saw Lena's panic, the way she clutched her daughter as if he were a wolf about to pounce. Whatever was happening here, scaring them off now, would mean losing the answer to a question he hadn't even dared to form. He needed them to stay. He needed to know. Clearing his throat, Elias forced the shock down, bearing it deep. He schooled his features back into a mask of gruff indifference. It felt brittle, ready to crack at any moment. The bunkhouse food is inedible, he said, his voice rougher than usual. The job pays $20 a month, plus room and board. The cook's quarters are attached to the main house. They're small, but they're clean. You start at sunrise. Relief and suspicion warred on Lena's face. She had expected rejection, perhaps even violence. This abrupt acceptance was disarming. She searched his eyes for a sign of his earlier shock, but found only the familiar hard glint of a rancher stating terms. Perhaps she had imagined it. Perhaps it was just the grief that clung to this man like a second skin. Thank you, Mr. Thorne, she managed, her voice trembling slightly. You won't regret it. See that I don't, he clipped, then turned to the door. Hank, he bellowed, his voice echoing across the yard. The foreman emerged from the path leading to the stables, wiping his hands on a rag. Boss? This is Lena Hale and her daughter Rosalie. She's our new cook. See to their wagon and get them settled in the quarters. Get one of the boys to bring their things. Hank's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but years of working for Elias had taught him not to question a direct order. He tipped his hat respectfully to Lena. Ma'am, this way. As Hank led them away, Elias retreated into the cavernous quiet of his house. He poured himself a whiskey with a shaking hand, the amber liquid sloshing over the rim of the glass. He downed it in one fiery gulp, the burn in his throat doing little to quell the inferno in his chest. Genevieve's eyes. He strode into his study, a room filled with maps and ledgers. From a locked drawer in his heavy oak desk, he pulled out a small, velvet-lined box. He hadn't opened it in years. Inside, nestled against the faded fabric, was a single hand-painted miniature portrait. It was Genevieve. Her hair was a cascade of dark auburn, her smile radiant and defiant, and her eyes. They were captured perfectly by the artist. The same cornflower blue, the same almond shape, the same mischievous tilt. He held the portrait, his thumb stroking the smooth, cool surface. She had been the daughter of a powerful shipping magnate from Galveston, sent west for her health, but in reality, to be kept away from unsuitable suitors. Elias had been the most unsuitable of all, a young land-poor rancher with nothing but grit and a wild dream. They had fallen into a love that was as fierce and untamable as the land itself. Her family had forbidden it. They had planned to marry in secret, but her father's men had arrived first, dragging her back east. Elias had been told she married someone else. 6 months later, a cold, formal letter informed him she had died of pneumonia. He had never believed it. Not the marriage, not the pneumonia. He had always suspected something darker, But he had no power, no means to challenge a man like her father, a veritable king in his own domain. So he had grieved, and he had worked, turning his small patch of dirt into an empire of cattle and grass, a monument to a love that had been stolen from him, and now a child with her eyes had appeared on his doorstep. The next few days passed in a state of surreal tension. Lena was an exceptional cook. The smell of baking bread and rich stews began to chase the stale air of neglect from the main house. The ranch hands, initially wary, were won over by the first hot meal. They treated Lena with a gruff respect, and they softened completely around Rosalie, sneaking her bits of candy and carving her little wooden animals. Elias kept his distance, watching from afar. He watched Lena work, her movements efficient, her face a constant mask of weary caution. He watched Rosalie play in the dust near the porch, a bright little flower in the bleak landscape. Her laughter, when it came, was like a melody he had forgotten existed. One afternoon he found her by the horse corral, staring up at his powerful black stallion, Midnight. The horse was notoriously ill-tempered, tolerating only Elias. "He's beautiful," the little girl whispered, not knowing Elias was standing behind her. "He is," Elias said, his voice startling her. "But he's got a mean streak. Best to stay clear." She looked up at him, her blue eyes wide and unafraid. "He doesn't look mean to me," she said. "He just looks lonely." The observation hit Elias like a physical blow. He saw himself in that horse, powerful, isolated, and achingly lonely. He knelt, an unaccustomed ache in his knees. "Where was your pa from, Rosalie?" Her face fell. "Mama says he went to heaven before I was born. She says he was a brave man." The answer was practiced, a story told and retold to a curious child. It told him nothing, and everything. Later, Hank found him on the porch. "She's a good woman, that Lena," Hank said, lighting his pipe. "And the little one's a ray of sunshine. But funny thing, boss, the girl, she's got a look about her. A look I feel like I've seen before." Hank was one of the few who had known Genevieve. He was treading carefully, but his meaning was clear. "It's just your imagination, old man," Elias said, his voice tight. "Maybe," Hank conceded, "but imagination is a powerful thing. Sometimes it shows you the truth you're too scared to look at directly." Hank ambled off, leaving Elias alone with the cold night and the even colder certainty growing in his gut. This was no coincidence. Lena hadn't just stumbled upon his ranch. She had sought it out. She knew something. She knew everything. And he, Elias Thorn, a man who controlled thousands of acres, was completely at the mercy of the secrets held by a penniless cook. He had let the past into his house, and he had a terrible feeling it was about to burn it to the ground. A month bled into the next. A fragile, unspoken truce settled over Thorn Creek Ranch. Elias, Lena, and Rosalie orbited each other in a careful, silent dance. By day, Lena ran the household with an efficiency that smoothed the rough edges of Elias's solitary life. He found his shirts mended without asking, a hot meal waiting no matter how late he returned, and a subtle order returning to rooms that had long been surrendered to dust. Rosalie was the center of this new gravity. The little girl, no longer hiding behind her mother's skirts, began to explore her new world. She followed Hank to the stables, asking endless questions. She sat on the porch steps, reading from old almanacs, her small voice murmuring made-up stories to an audience of dust motes. Elias found himself drawn to her, a moth to a flame that threatened to burn him. He started leaving his work an hour earlier, timing his return to catch her before Lena called her in for the night. One afternoon, he took a small, gentle mare and lifted Rosalie into the saddle in front of him. Her tiny body was stiff with nervous excitement at first, but as they trotted slowly around the main yard, she relaxed, her delighted laughter echoing in the still air. "Faster, Mr. Thorne, faster!" she squealed. For the first time in 5 years, a genuine smile touched Elias's lips. He felt a forgotten warmth spread through his chest, a dangerous and addictive feeling. He looked down at the top of her head, the auburn hair so like Genevieve's, and the ache of his old grief mingled with a new, fierce sense of possession. Lena watched them from the kitchen window, a dishcloth frozen in her hands. Her face was a mask of complicated emotions. There was relief in seeing her daughter so happy and safe, but it was overshadowed by a deep, gnawing fear. This was what she had dreaded, The bond forming between them was a tangible thing, a rope pulling the truth closer to the surface with every passing day. Elias was not a stupid man. His kindness was not simple charity. It was an investigation. One evening after Rosalie was asleep, Elias found Lena on the back porch mending one of his shirts by lantern light. "She's a bright child," Elias said, breaking the silence. He leaned against a porch post, his large frame seeming to swallow the small space. Lena didn't look up from her sewing. "She is. Takes a strong woman to raise a child like that on her own," he continued, his voice deceptively casual. "Her father must have been a good man." The needle in Lena's hand paused for a fraction of a second. "He was," she said, her voice tight. "A prospector. Went looking for gold in the mountains and never came back. A rock slide," they said. The story was smooth, well rehearsed, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the shirt. Elias's patience, worn thin by weeks of silent speculation, finally snapped. "And what was his name? This prospector?" Lena finally looked up. Her hazel eyes flashed with a spark of defiance born of desperation. "His name was John. John Hale." The lie was so bald, so simple, it was almost an insult. Elias felt a surge of anger. He wasn't some fool to be placated with children's stories. He wanted to grab her, to shake the truth from her, to demand she explain the ghost of his dead love he saw every time he looked at her daughter. But he reined himself in. An explosion would send her running, and he couldn't risk that. He would play her game. For now. "A shame," he said, his voice dropping, becoming cold and sharp. "The mountains have a way of taking good men." He turned and walked back into the house, leaving her in the flickering lantern light, the unspoken threat hanging in the air. Lena's hands trembled. She finally put the sewing aside, her carefully constructed wall beginning to crumble. The warning came 2 weeks later, not as a whisper, but on the back of a freight wagon. A grizzled driver named Peterson, who made a monthly run from San Antonio, pulled up to the ranch with supplies. While the hands unloaded flour and coffee, Peterson handed Hank a small sealed envelope. "This is for your cook, Lena Hale," he said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Fellow in redemption paid me 2 bits to make sure it got to her. Said it was urgent." Hank, sensing trouble, took the letter. He found Lena kneading dough in the kitchen. "A letter for you, Lena," he said gently. The change was instantaneous and terrifying. All the color drained from Lena's face. Her eyes, wide with panic, darted from the letter to the windows, as if expecting to see monsters peering in. "Who?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who is it from?" Peterson didn't say. "Just a man in town." With a trembling hand, she took the envelope. She didn't open it. She just stared at the unfamiliar script, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She clutched it to her chest and fled to her room, slamming the door. From his study, Elias had heard it all. He walked into the kitchen, his expression dark. "What was that about?" Hank shook his head, his face grim. "A letter from someone in town." She looked like she'd seen the devil himself, Elias. Elias stared at the closed door to the cook's quarters. The truce was over. Whatever Lena Hale had been running from, it was catching up. And it was coming for his ranch, for the little girl with Genevieve's eyes, and for a truth he was now certain would be more devastating than he could ever have imagined. The whispers of the past were about to become a roar. The letter shattered the fragile peace of Thorn Creek. Lena became a ghost in the house she maintained, her face etched with a constant, harrowing anxiety. She startled at every unexpected sound. She kept Rosalie glued to her side. The light in the little girl's eyes began to dim, replaced by a confused sadness. Elias watched this transformation with a grim, mounting anger. The fear radiating from Lena was a palpable thing, poisoning the air. Whatever was in that letter was a direct threat, and by extension, a threat to his ranch and the child he was now certain was his blood. He gave her 2 days. Then he cornered her in the kitchen one night after the rest of the ranch was asleep. He bolted the main door and stood before her, an immovable object. The half-opened letter lay on the table. "The game is over, Lena," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You are going to tell me who you're running from. Now." Tears streamed down her face. "You don't understand. If he finds us—" "Who finds you?" Elias pressed. Give me the name. You can't help, she sobbed. No one can. He's powerful, relentless. I have 200 head of cattle, 10,000 acres of land, and a dozen men who will follow my word as if it was scripture. Elias countered, his voice like iron. Try me. His sheer force of will seemed to break her. She sank into a chair, her body trembling. His name is Bartholomew Corrigan, she whispered. They call him Bart. The name meant nothing to Elias. And who is Bart Corrigan to you? Her story came out in a torrent. She was from Santa Fe. Her family, once respectable merchants, had fallen on hard times. Corrigan, a man of immense and ill-gotten wealth, had been a business associate of her father's. When her father died in debt, Corrigan saw his opportunity. He didn't want a wife, Lena said, her voice filled with shame. He wanted a possession. He paid off my family's debts, and in return, I was to be his ward, his companion. I was his property, living in a gilded cage. Elias's hands clenched into fists. He had known men like Corrigan. I endured it for 2 years, she continued. Then, I found out I was with child. She glanced at Rosalie's closed door. I knew what he would do. He would claim the child as his own, another possession to control. So I ran. I've been running ever since. That letter, it means he knows I'm here. He's close. It was a harrowing tale, but Elias noticed the crucial omission. She spoke of the child, but not of the father. Why here, Lena? Elias asked, his voice probing. Of all the ranches in Texas, why Thorn Creek? Lena hesitated. Because I knew of you in Santa Fe. They said you were a hard man, but a fair one. They said you understood loss. She paused, then delivered the carefully chosen half-truth. I knew Genevieve. Elias flinched as if struck. The name spoken aloud in this house for the first time in years was a physical shock. Genevieve was a friend, Lena said carefully. Before she was sent away from you, she spoke of you, of this place. I hoped it would be the one place Corrigan would never think to look for me, a place tied to a ghost. It was brilliant, a story designed to earn his sympathy and his protection by invoking the name of his greatest love, while keeping the child's true parentage a secret. But she had miscalculated. Invoking Genevieve's name didn't just earn his sympathy, it solidified his conviction. He looked at her, at the terror in her eyes, and he made a decision. He would protect her. He would protect them both. Not just because it was the right thing to do, but because he was protecting his own. He would let her keep her final secret. For now, confronting her with the whole truth would have to wait. The immediate danger was real. Corrigan will not set foot on this ranch, Elias declared, his voice ringing with absolute authority. You and Rosalie are under my protection. This is your home now. No one will harm you here. He reached out, picked up the letter from the table, and without reading it, walked to the stove and tossed it into the glowing embers. They watched together as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. For the first time in 5 years, Lena felt a flicker of hope. But as she looked at Elias's grim, determined face, she knew she had only traded one cage for another. The shadow of Bart Corrigan was terrifying, but the power of Elias Thorne's simmering truth was a force of nature all its own. Elias Thorne's declaration turned the ranch into a fortress. He doubled the night watch, positioning armed hands at the valley's entrance and on the ridges overlooking the homestead. He rode the perimeter himself each day, his Winchester rifle resting in its scabbard, his eyes scanning the horizon. The ranch hands, loyal to a fault, didn't need an explanation. Hank had told them enough. There's trouble coming for the cook and her little girl. The boss says we keep them safe. That was all they needed to hear. These were hard men, and the idea of a wealthy predator hunting a woman and child offended their rough code of honor. Lena watched it all unfold with a mixture of awe and terror. She had never known protection like this. The sheer force of Elias's will was a shield around her and Rosalie. Rosalie, sensitive to the shift in atmosphere, grew more withdrawn. She understood that the grim-faced men with rifles were there for her and her mother. One evening she came to Elias as he was cleaning his colt on the porch. "Are the bad men coming, Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her blue eyes wide and serious. Elias stopped his work. He couldn't lie to those eyes. "There's a man who wants to bother your mother. We're just making sure he can't. Are you going to protect us? She asked. With my life, he answered, the words coming out with a conviction that startled even himself. A week passed. The tension stretched thin. Then the news came. Hank rode in from Redemption, his face grim. Elias, there are 2 men in town, strangers, flashy clothes, expensive guns. They're staying at the hotel, buying rounds at the saloon, and asking questions. What kind of questions? Elias asked, his voice dangerously low. About a woman, Hank said. A woman traveling alone with a little girl with dark auburn hair. They're describing Lena. The hunt was over. Corrigan's men had found their trail. They were gathering information, probing for weaknesses. Time had run out. That night, Elias waited until the house was still. He built up the fire in the main room's hearth. He sent Hank to fetch Lena, telling him to make sure Rosalie was fast asleep. Lena entered the room, her face pale. She saw the look on Elias's face and knew this was the final reckoning. His men are in Redemption, he said without preamble. It's only a matter of time before Corrigan himself shows up. They'll come here, and when they do, there will be blood. My men might die protecting you. Before I ask them to risk their lives, I need the whole truth, not the stories, everything. Lena began to tremble. I told you. No, he interrupted. He stood up, walked to his study, and returned with a small velvet-lined box. He opened it and placed the miniature portrait of Genevieve on the mantelpiece, where the firelight illuminated her smiling face and her impossibly blue eyes. You told me you knew Genevieve, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You told me she was a friend. You used her memory to get through my gate. Now you will tell me the truth of it, and you will look at her while you do it. Lena stared at the portrait, and her composure shattered completely. A great, shuddering sob escaped her. The secret she had carried for so long came pouring out. I wasn't just her friend, she wept. I was her lady's maid, her confidant. When her father dragged her back from Texas, she was already carrying your child. Elias stood as still as a statue, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had known, but hearing it confirmed was like a lightning strike. Her family was horrified, Lena continued, her eyes fixed on Genevieve's portrait. They locked her away. Their plan was to take the baby as soon as it was born and send it to an orphanage, to erase the scandal. She wiped her eyes, her voice gaining a desperate strength. But Genevieve fought them. She made me promise. She knew she was weak, that the birth would be hard. She made me swear on my life that if anything happened, I would take her baby and run. That one day when it was safe, I would bring her here, to you. She said you would know she was yours the moment you saw her eyes. The story of the pneumonia had been a lie. Genevieve had died from complications of childbirth, alone and a prisoner in her own home. But in her final moments, she had orchestrated her daughter's escape. Lena, true to her word, had taken the newborn Rosalie and fled into the night. And Corrigan? Elias asked, his voice a rasp. He had been one of her father's chosen suitors, Lena explained. He was obsessed with her. When he learned she had died, but that a child had vanished, he put 2 and 2 together. He didn't care that the child wasn't his. He saw her as the last piece of Genevieve, something he was entitled to own. He has been hunting us for 5 years. Silence descended on the room. Elias walked to the mantelpiece and picked up the portrait, his gaze shifting from Genevieve's painted eyes to the closed door of the room where their daughter slept. Everything, the 5 years of desolate grief, the hard-won empire of grass and cattle, the solitude, it all realigned, snapping into a new, terrifying, and beautiful clarity. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He wasn't just a man avenging a lost love. He was a father, and hell was coming to his doorstep. The dawn broke cold and gray, the sky a sheet of unpolished steel. There was no birdsong. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. Elias had been up all night with Hank. The plan was simple, brutal, and final. There would be no negotiation. There would be no surrender. Thorn Creek was his, and what was his, he protected. He had sent riders out before sunrise, not to flee, but to watch the main trail and send back a signal when Corrigan's party was spotted. Inside the house, Lena was packing biscuits and filling canteens, her movements swift. The terror of the previous night had been burned away, replaced by a grim resolve. She was no longer just a refugee. She was a mother defending her child's home. Rosalie, blessedly unaware, had been told they were preparing for a storm and was helping stack firewood away from the windows. The signal came just after 9, a single rifle shot echoing from the northern ridge. It meant a party of more than 5 riders. "They're here," Hank said, standing beside Elias on the porch. "Get the men in position," Elias ordered, his face a granite mask. "Bar the bunkhouse. This fight happens here, at the house. We protect the woman and the child." The ranch hands, armed and ready, moved with quiet discipline to their designated spots. Elias took his position at an upstairs window with a clear view of the front yard. He could see them now, a column of 8 riders moving at a confident trot. At their head was a man on a fine gray stallion, dressed in an expensive black suit, Bart Corrigan. They stopped just out of rifle range. One man rode forward under a white flag. "Don't shoot," Elias called down. "Let's hear what the vulture has to say." Corrigan himself rode forward. His face was handsome in a cruel, sharp way. "Thorn," he shouted, his voice smooth and cultured. "I believe you have something of mine, a woman named Lena Hale and a child. This is a private matter. Send them out, and we will be on our way." Elias leaned out the window, his voice rolling across the yard like a thunderclap. "Everything on this land is my business, Corrigan. The woman is under my protection, and the child." Elias paused, letting the words hang in the air. "The child is my daughter. You will turn your horses around and ride out of this valley now. This is the only warning you will get." A flicker of surprise, then rage, crossed Corrigan's face. "You're a fool, Thorn," he spat. "That girl is the last remnant of a fine bloodline. You think I'll let her be raised by a dirt-scrabbling cattleman? I'll tear this place apart stone by stone." "Try it," Elias answered coldly, and withdrew from the window. Corrigan wheeled his horse around. A moment later, he raised his hand and dropped it. The crack of rifles split the morning silence. The siege began. Corrigan's men were professionals, advancing methodically, using the terrain for cover. But Elias's men were fighting for their home. They were better shots and they knew every rock and ditch. The air filled with the roar of gunfire and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Inside, Lena took Rosalie to the root cellar. "You stay here like a brave girl until Mama comes to get you," she whispered, kissing her forehead. Then she went back upstairs. She found Hank reloading. "Give me one," she demanded. "Ma'am, your place is with the child." "My child is in danger because of what's out there," she said, her voice steely. "I can load. I can shoot. I'm done running." He saw the fire in her eyes and handed her a spare rifle. The battle raged for over an hour. A bullet grazed Hank's arm. One of the hands was hit in the leg. But Corrigan's men were faring worse. Elias, firing from his upstairs perch, was a deadly marksman. He took down 2 of the gunmen himself, fighting with the ferocity of a bear defending its cub. Seeing his forces dwindling, Corrigan grew desperate. He and his remaining 3 men made a final, reckless charge toward the house. It was a fatal mistake. The concentrated fire from the house and corral was devastating. One gunman was thrown from his saddle. Another clutched his chest and fell. Corrigan's fine gray stallion went down, screaming, pinning his leg beneath it. An eerie silence fell over the ranch. Elias descended the stairs, his rifle ready. He strode across the yard and stood over the wealthy man, who was now just a panicked, broken figure. Corrigan looked up, his arrogance replaced by terror. "Please," he whimpered. "My leg. It's broken. Take what you want. Money. I'll give you anything." Elias looked down at him with contempt. "You have nothing I want." He wouldn't give him a warrior's death. He turned to Hank. "Get him on a wagon. Take him and his wounded to the sheriff in Redemption. Tell Sheriff Miller they're to be charged with attempted murder." He turned and walked back toward the house. He had won. The shadow that had haunted Lena and Rosalie for 5 years had been vanquished. He walked into the house, past a bloodied but resolute Hank, past Lena, who was looking at him with eyes full of awe and something more. He went to the cellar, opened it, and called down into the darkness. Rosalie, it's over. The storm has passed. The aftermath was quiet and raw. Hank and the men, nursing minor injuries, oversaw the grim cleanup. Inside the house, a different quiet reigned. Elias sat at the dining table staring at his hands. He was a father. The reality of it was a weight and a wonder. Lena placed a cup of steaming coffee in front of him. She was no longer the frightened woman who had arrived on his doorstep. The siege had forged her into something new, something strong. "Thank you, Elias," she said, her voice soft. It held a deep, abiding gratitude between equals. "I protected what was mine," he replied, his gaze lifting to meet hers. The simple statement held a world of meaning. It included the ranch, the child, and her. He looked toward the living room, where Rosalie was carefully wrapping a strip of cloth around the leg of a small wooden horse. Seeing her so innocent, so safe, solidified something in his soul. He stood and walked over to his daughter. He knelt before her. "Rosalie," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "There's something I need to tell you. Your father, he didn't die in the mountains. He was waiting for you. He just didn't know you were here yet." He took a deep breath. "I am your father, Rosalie." She stared at him, her little brow furrowed. She looked from his earnest face to her mother, who stood watching, tears silently tracing paths down her cheeks. Lena nodded, giving her a small, encouraging smile. Rosalie looked back at Elias. She reached out a small hand and gently touched his rough, weathered cheek. It was a gesture of simple, profound acceptance. "Does this mean," she asked, her voice small, "that I can ride midnight?" A choked laugh escaped Elias's lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. "Yes," he said, pulling her into a fierce hug. "Yes, you can." The days that followed were not a storybook ending, but a real beginning. A new family began to take shape, forged in secrets and sealed in conflict. Elias Thorn, the solitary rancher, learned the awkward, wonderful language of fatherhood. Lena was no longer just the cook. She became the mistress of the house, a partner to Elias in raising their daughter. Their bond was something different, built on shared peril, mutual respect, and a deep, abiding love for the child who connected them. One evening, weeks later, the three of them stood on the porch, watching the sunset. Rosalie stood between them, holding both their hands. The land before them, once a monument to Elias's grief, now stretched out as a promise. It was no longer just Thorn Creek Ranch. It was home. And so the dust of the Chihuahuan desert, which once settled like a shroud over Elias Thorn's heart, was finally swept away by the winds of change. A simple knock, a desperate woman, and the impossible eyes of a little girl were all it took to resurrect a buried past and forge a new future. Their story reminds us that family isn't always born of convention, but is often forged in the fires of adversity and love. It teaches us that home isn't just a place you own, but a place you protect. If this tale of the Old West captured your imagination, please give this video a like and share it with a fellow storyteller. And be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales of grit, heart, and history. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss a new story from the frontier.